morning. Politicians can be so funny. How did we ever make jokes without them? No? Okay. It's interesting to see Mark Carney on The Daily Show talking to Jon Stewart about the whole idea of, us becoming part of the United States. And, Mark kind of sat there and said, well, it's just not going to happen. And then he said to Jon Stewart, it's not you, it's us. And at one point, Jon Stewart said, I feel like you've been breaking up with me this whole issue, or this whole episode. But yeah, it was kind of funny watching that. And of course, there's lots of Donald Trump jokes that are going around, unfortunately. One that I heard that I'm going to kind of repeat. It's not really a joke, it's more of an observation. It's a bit racist, so forgive me. It's a lot better if I was brown-skinned if I told the joke, but I'm not. I understand that. I'm not totally, oblivious to that fact. But basically, I don't even know what the guy's name was, but he was a guy from Mexico. And he was talking about Canada's plight. And he said, if Canada is serious about not becoming the 51st state, what you need to do is import a whole bunch of Mexicans and brown-skinned people, millions of them, into your country, and watch how fast Donald Trump goes from wanting you to be the 51st state to building a wall between you and them. Like I said, it was a bit racist, and unfortunately, though, I think what got me was it was also probably a bit true. Not that, how can I say this and not be, you wish that we had gotten by this, that this wasn't a thing? Like, really? I mean, are we more mature than this? Can't we do things, the color of your skin, the gender that you are? I mean, does it really matter? This is something that was important maybe 150 years ago. Why is it still important now? And it in some ways, it just breaks my heart that we're still fighting the same kind of ideas. Slavery in North America was an absolutely horrible moment for us. And I've said that slavery as we knew it 150 years ago, 200 years ago, is different from slavery that's in the Bible. And in some ways, that is a true observation. A lot of the slavery that is talked about in the Bible is not permanent, and slavery in North America was. It is not hereditary. Children were never born into slavery where they were in North America. And it was, what did I get? It's not hereditary, it's not permanent, and it was not racial. People entered into slave agreements for many different reasons, some of it just to pay off a debt. That does not mean that it wasn't bad. Slavery, wherever we have seen it, has always been horrible. It has been immoral. It has been something that we never, ever want to go back to. But it was a little different in the Bible times to what it was in North America 150 years ago. In fact, slavery as we knew it was so bad that black people could earn their freedom But they often wouldn't leave the area in which they had lived and worked, because if they did, they were subject to recapture and being sold again as a slave, just because of the color of their skin. And so they would stay in the same places. They would hang around the same family that used to own them, because it was the safest place to be. And it's kind of a horrible thing to think about. Having said everything that I just did, when we go back to Exodus and we see the slavery that is demonstrated in Exodus, the first few chapters, it's very much like the slavery that we knew. In Egypt, it was hereditary. You were born into it. It was racial. It was directed at one group of people. And it was permanent. There was no way out. And so, as God starts this tale in Exodus, he basically comes to Moses and says, listen, I have seen the people, and they're suffering. And I've come to do something about it. And then, of course, he says the kicker, I'm sending you. And Moses is going, no, Lord, not me. Why would you send me? And Moses has a very unique story. He starts off not as a slave, but as one of the few Hebrews that is actually living a life that is free and a privilege, as he's living in the royal palace. And he has all of the advantages that his cousins do not have because of where he is. And he grows up and he spends his first 40 years there, and then he goes to the defense of one of his people and kills an overseer and decides that he has to leave. And for the next 40 years, he spends that time in the wilderness. He gets married. He becomes a shepherd. He has kids. And as far as he's concerned, that time in the palace, that time in Egypt is so long ago that it doesn't intersect with his life anymore. It is simply way back there. And yet God finds him. There's this burning bush that isn't consumed. There's nothing absolutely strange about a burning bush. Bushes burned in the desert all the time. But this one was not consumed. And so Moses goes over and looks at it and says, this is strange. This is different. And he meets with God. I think part of the surprise is, as I'm reading the story, is I don't see any real connection between Moses and God up until this point. There's no indication that he was a God-fearing person. He grew up in the Pharaoh's house with different gods. In fact, the Pharaoh himself was a god. But here, Moses decides that he needs to build a relationship with this God. God says, I'm sending you. And Moses tries to get out of it every way he can. But God continues, no, this is the plan. Moses, I know you. I know that it's not 40 years ago when you were in power. That didn't work. Then you were depending on yourself. Now I need you to depend on me, and I am sending you to free my people who are in slavery and who need somebody to come to their defense. And this morning, I just want to pick up the story right about there. One more thought. When we started talking about Moses and the Pharaoh, often we treat this like it is a competition between two men. And I don't think we've got that right. It is a competition between two gods. One is known. The people of Egypt recognize that the Pharaoh is God, that he is all powerful, that he can do what he wants. And Moses is bringing in this God who is basically unknown. Just think about this. There is no ritual, there's no nothing, except maybe a few stories about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and their interactions with this God. They don't know what to do. But God meets Moses and says, listen, I am going to lead you. I'm going to teach you what to do. We're going to pick up the story in Exodus chapter 5. Afterwards, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go so they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness. And that first blank is confronting reality. Hey, Pharaoh, let my people just go into the wilderness for a few days. We're going to hold the convention. Got some special speakers, got some music happening. Just let us go out there for now. We'll come back. What do you think? And Pharaoh's going, you're slaves. You don't do that. Of course he does. But in this moment, he has to try to confront reality. What is really going on here? And the first thing is that Moses is sitting there saying, God has told me. God has led me to this conclusion that Israel needs to go out and we need to have a festival. And Pharaoh has to come to this idea about whether what the people say is right. Because the people are calling him God. And I don't know. If you started calling me God, I think I'd know that I wasn't. And so I wonder, now I know he's been brought up in this whole system, but I have to wonder if Pharaoh really, does he buy this? Or is he actually being confronted by the real God? In this moment, is there a bit of doubt that Pharaoh himself is God? And we have this problem in our own lives. We sometimes start to believe our own myths, our own backstory. We start thinking, we are good about in this. We are talented. We deserve something that sometimes it's not really real, and we know it. We are a broken people still in need of God. I was doing some studying on the Great Game. The Great Game was a competition. This is all kind of devaluing what it was, but between Russia and Britain. Russia and Britain basically were fighting over Southeast Asia during this time. And one of the areas that they were fighting over was Afghanistan. And when you look back at the history of some of these nations, you start to realize that, nothing has really changed. The same fights that are there today were there 100 years ago and 100 years before that. Afghanistan has been called the graveyard of empires because that's where empires went to die. But basically what happened at this point, which is about the 1840s, is that Russia and Britain were competing for Afghanistan. And they had their spies out who were watching. And the British spies had seen Russian troops moving towards Afghanistan. Now, they moved towards and then they went back. They didn't actually go in. But Britain came to believe that they were going to take Afghanistan. So if Britain wanted to get Afghanistan, they had to go first. And so they got an army and they went into Afghanistan. And can I just warn you, if you're wanting to read about this is absolutely a horribly gory story. It is an absolutely horrible tale of war and pain and death and unimaginable suffering. But there are some comedic moments. So just know that this is a horrible time. I'm going to give you the comedic moment. One of the commanders that was going to Afghanistan was a guy who was a knight, and his name was Robert Sale. And Sir Robert decided that he was going to go to Afghanistan to fight a war against the Afghanistan people, who I think he believed were like children. So this probably wouldn't be much of a fight. And oh, was he wrong. But him and a few of the officers decided, since they were going away to a foreign country to fight a war, and you have to understand, this is 1800s. So there's no transport trucks, there's no cars, there's no helicopters, there's no planes. Anything you're doing, you have to do with your back and whatever beast of burden you can take with you. And it seems like Britain didn't have any idea what kind of terrain this was going to be. They weren't prepared. They brought the wrong guns to the war, for instance. They brought short range guns where the Afghanistans all were equipped with long range. They brought artillery. But the path at this one certain spot was so steep and so narrow, they couldn't get the artillery up the pass. And so they had to dismantle the artillery and take it by hand up this pass and over the other side, and then reassemble it together. So just to give you a bit of the backstory to the fight, that's kind of what's going on. Because Robert and a few of the officers decide in their infinite wisdom that they're going to war, but they don't want to be away from their wife and children. So they take them with them. And you're going, what? At least should be. What do you mean they took their wives and children with? They took their wives and children. The idea was, we'll go fight the Afghanistans during the day, and then we'll come home and have a home-cooked meal at night. But it gets even worse than that. Robert Sale's wife, Lady Florentia Sale, was the mother of a beautiful daughter, Alexandria, who was pregnant at this time. These are all going over to Afghanistan. And Alexandria plays the piano. Could you imagine trying to lug that Roland up through the pass, trying to get into Afghanistan so that your daughter can play the piano? They didn't have the Roland. They took a grand piano. They took this grand piano and carried it through this mountain pass into Afghanistan to Kabul, where they were going to set up their homes. And it almost sounds too ludicrous to be true. But sometimes that's exactly what we do. We think we've got everything together, but really what we're doing is we're hauling a piano through a pass. And it's ridiculous. At some point, you would think somebody would have confronted reality and said, this is not going to work. At some point, you think we would confront reality and understand that this is not going to work. The British actually were divided up into 3 troops. Florentia and Alexandria stayed in Kabul, which was the one that had the most problems. The other 2, actually her husband was with one of the other 2, and they were fairly okay. But the Kabul one was not. And they had to make their escape. And in Florentia and Alexandria's defense, they acquitted themselves very well. They ended up in captivity for 9 months before they were finally let go. The piano, in case you're wondering, got burned. But sometimes it's just like, oh, am I trying to carry a piano through a pass? Have I become that deluded, God, that I'm doing things that I know shouldn't be done? Pharaoh is in this moment where he has to confront reality. He has to decide whether he's God enough to face God. And something inside me tells me that he knew he wasn't. But his only hope was that maybe Moses' God wasn't either. And so as he makes this question, he has to come to the conclusion that, yes, I am more powerful than the God of Moses. Let's continue on with the story. Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go?" Who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? That next blank is the correct question. It really was. It was the right question. It was the question actually that Moses asked. Who are you, God? Who should I say is coming? Give me your name. I follow a guy named Tim David Kelly. He is the guitarist for a band named Kicking Herald. I'd love to tell you that I've been a big fan of Kicking Herald for a long time, but that would be like not the truth. I didn't even know who Kicking Herald was. I became interested in Kelly not because of his band or his guitar prowess, but because he tells great stories. And so I started to listen to some of his stories. And most of them are about the music business, and some of the bands that I listened to growing up talks a lot about 70s and 80s and 90s rock stars. So Tim Kelly actually tells a story about a band in the late 60s who were starting out. They were just, getting that start on. They haven't really built up their audience yet. And so they're going out. They've got this opportunity for this concert. So they set up. They're going to do this concert. They're backstage. The curtains are drawn. They can't tell who's out there, but they start listening for noise. They start, well, what is it? Is the place packed? But they're not hearing anything. So they start, well, it would be okay maybe if it's half packed. But they're not even hearing half packed noise. And they're going, well, maybe it's a small intimate. No, that's okay. It's a small intimate gathering, and we'll play for them. And so the time comes for the concert to start, and the curtains are drawn back, and there's one guy sitting in the audience. And this one guy decides that he's going to leave at this point. And so the band hollers to him. They say, hey, if you'll stay, we'll do our whole show for you if you just stay and listen to us. And so the guy decided, okay, I'll stay and listen. He sat down in one of the seats, and the band started to play for the next hour. They're set. And when the hour's done, this guy gets up and applauds them. And I suppose they probably had a bit of a conversation, and then the guy left. Over the years, this same guy would show up at concerts. And always at the end of the concert, he'd go up to the band and say, "Remember me?" And they'd say, "Yeah, we remember you. You were that guy. You're the guy that stayed and watched that concert, 15 years ago." The band was Led Zeppelin. The guy, well, they don't actually know his name. He's never told them who he was. But does that really matter? Because on that one night, when Led Zeppelin had an empty house, one guy showed up, and he stayed and allowed them to perform for him. And over the years, he became a super fan. He kept on showing up at various concerts, at various places, with that whole "remember me" attitude. when they needed him most, it wasn't his name that mattered. It was what he did. So Pharaoh says, who is the Lord? Who is he? And the reality is that his name doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what he's called. What matters is what he will do. So when Moses gets to the burning bush and they're having this conversation, Moses says, who are you, Lord? If they ask me who you are, what should I tell them? And God replies with the comment, Haya Asher Haya, which is, I am that I am, or it's, I will be what I will be. But basically, it's just simply this idea of, I am the God that exists. Moses, you grew up in Egypt. You grew up with Pharaoh. You know who their gods are. And you know that they can't do anything. 400 years ago, when Egypt was in trouble, a guy named Joseph came. And Joseph met with Pharaoh, and Joseph interpreted the dreams, and Pharaoh made him number 2 in the nation. And under his leadership, Egypt was able to take the years of plenty and store up grain so that when the famine hit, they could live. And not just live, but they could help the world, the known world, to live. It didn't matter the name of Joseph's God. What mattered was what Joseph's God did. And now I know pharaohs have fallen away from that belief. But it still doesn't matter what the name is. It matters what that God will do. We simply call him God. God is not his name. God is a title that we give him. It is the same name that we could be giving a lot of other non-beings. In fact, we do that. But that doesn't matter. What matters is what that God will do. And that's the question that we have to struggle with is what God do we want? We don't follow him because of his name. We follow him because of what he's done. Exodus 5:2, the rest of that verse says, I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go. And that last blank is just simply this, restoration versus revolution. So first we have to confront reality and hopefully realize that we need God. That God is so important to our everyday life. It's part of what we do in Lent. Lent is this time when we confront our mortality and realize that we absolutely require God, that we need God to survive. So once we've confronted reality, then we have to ask for the name. And God comes to us and says, you know what, my name doesn't matter. What matters is what I will do. And then we have a choice between restoration or revolution. I think I got a dude that I want to show next. His name is Janus. There he is. You know him well, I know. It's actually the god that we take the name January from, is Janus. Janus is often pictured with a face on the front and a face on the back, one that looks forward and one that looks backward. One that is looking towards what will be done and one that is concentrating on the past. I have no idea which is which. I'm assuming probably the bearded one's looking back, but I'm not really sure on that. But Janus has two faces. He's often seen as the god of both war, conflict, and of peace. But he also brings chaos in his wings because he is double-minded. He is split between forward and backward. A friend asked me what my favorite car was. And he thought maybe my favorite car might be a Mustang because I happen to own a Mustang. But I told him, no, it's really, the Mustang's an accident. My favorite car is a 1963 split window coupe. I kind of like that one right there. Looks pretty good. So if anybody wants to buy me one, there it is. It's an executive car. And if my dad's here this morning, if my dad and I had a 63 Corvette, we would probably set out to restore it. We would make it hopefully into what it was, maybe with a few different, adjustments. I was noticing that this one, and my dad can maybe tell me later, but it's got 4 exhaust pipes in the middle. And I'm not sure if that was stock or whether somebody's added that later. But we'd probably try to restore it back to the way it was. There's times when restoration is a thing that we want to do. But when the engineers at Chevrolet sit down and they try to make what the next Corvette's going to look like, they don't think back to this car and say, hey, why don't we recreate a 1963 split window coupe? They don't do that. They do something different. There's been actually 8 generations of Corvette, if you wanted to know that. I got a picture of the first generation, which was a little bit more bubbly. Yeah, there it is. It's a little bit rounder, the first generation was. More straight lines in the second generation. But they don't even go back to that. I mean, the last generation, the most recent one is that right there. That's a C8. Generation 8 Corvette. And it doesn't look anything like the first generation. Still looks pretty good to me, but, we don't try to go back and reimagine if we're trying to go forward. We don't want to have restoration. We want revolution. But revolution is hard. Revolution is difficult. I was thinking back to the Russian Revolution in the early 1900s. And there's so much in that part of the world that is just simply the world on repeat. The Crimean War they fought in the 1850s over Crimea is basically the same war they're fighting in Ukraine right now. Somebody asked if they thought that Russia would stop without gaining the Crimea, and the answer was no, because they've been fighting for that thing for hundreds of years. They're not going to stop just because of whatever. It's not going to happen. In the early 1900s, Russia lost to Japan in a war, the Russo-Japanese War, and they lost it. They had been dreaming of empire. They had been dreaming of taking all of Asia and having it under a Russian flag, and they failed against Japan. And that caused problems within the government of Russia. In fact, it was the first kind of nick in the Romanov throne, and Tsar Nicholas II. World War I broke out, and Russia took heavy losses during World War I, until finally it ended up in a civil war between a whole bunch of factors who wanted control of the nation, with the Bolshevik communists eventually winning out. We call it the Russian Revolution. But as I look back at that period of time, I'm going, there really wasn't a revolution here. It wasn't new. It was just the same old with different faces and different titles. Nothing happened that actually changed, and nothing's happening now in Russia that is changing. We're still fighting the same war on repeat. It just happens over and over and over again. And it's not a war of revolution, it's a war of restoration. It's looking backwards. And most of our fights are doing exactly that. We don't want something new. We want something old. And God comes to us and says this, listen, I want to do a revolution. I want to accomplish something new, and I want you to be part of it. I want you to be part of a movement of love that the world has never seen before. I want you to be part of a time when all people are valued in spite of their race, in spite of their gender, in spite of any of the dividing lines that we use to separate us. I want that. And we keep on going back and saying, well, God, that's not really what we want. We want restoration. We want to look backwards, not forwards. I was part of a denomination, not this one, I won't tell you which one, but I went to a conference once. And the guy in the conference knew us fairly well. And he basically said to all these, denominational people, he said, your denomination is absolutely set perfectly if the 1950s should ever come back. Yeah, it was a good laugh. Didn't feel funny at the time. But we're looking backwards. We want to try to do something that's already been done when God is saying, listen, I want to do a revolution. I want to change the way the future looks. Here's a question for you. Do I want to restore what was, which is the comfortable choice? Or do I want revolution, the uncomfortable choice? The Bible often says that God hardens Pharaoh's heart. I'm not sure that is true. It is part of a theology of the Old Testament that says that God can accomplish anything. So if he allows anything to happen, then he must have caused it. I think Pharaoh's heart was hardened by a want for restoration. It was hardened by a desire not to do anything new, not to have a new vision, not to have a new path forward. Pharaoh didn't want to value people. He didn't want to give up his slaves. He wanted everything to continue as it was. And if you look at our history, it's a battle we continually keep on fighting. Even inside the church, we're still fighting the same war of wanting to keep things the way they were rather than stepping into the revolution that God has asked us to be a part of. To be able to change the world with his love. To see people as equals regardless of who they are. To recognize that our brothers and sisters are so valuable to God that he sent his son to die on a cross for us. And that in our mortality, there is absolutely nothing we can do without God. And until we confront that reality, we will be spinning our wheels and going nowhere. My prayer this Lent is that maybe we can stop spinning our wheels and allow God to truly be the God of our lives and to take us where it is that he needs us to go, to help us love those who are around us with a love that can only come from him, to help us see each other as important because God sees them that way, to get rid of all of the biases that we carry and allow God to do a work in our midst. It's where I want to go. Let me pray. Father, I thank you for the hand that you've had on this place. And I ask, God, that you would help us to confront our own realities, our own mortality, and recognize how deeply we need you. And that, God, as you invite us into revolution, that we wouldn't stick our feet into the ground and try to slow you down, but that we would embrace the future that you have for us. God, help us live Jesus' message, to love even our enemies, to pray for those who persecute us, to want your vision and your kingdom to be right here with us. We pray, God, that we would give you the permission to move right here in this place and in our lives as we leave this place. God, that you would be the testimony that comes out of our lives every day of the week. We pray this in the name of Jesus. Amen.
No one is higher, God of provider, Prince of Peace. He is good beyond measure, worthy forever and always. No one is higher, God of provider, Prince of Peace. He is good beyond measure, worthy forever. Elohim, the God.